Welcome to Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. I'm Matthew Wynn, the podcast host, and we're in Series 8. Series 8 is all about campaigns that have changed how healthcare is delivered and how we support people across lots of different places in the NHS and further beyond. And I'm delighted to have Paula McGowan, who many of you that listen to this, I'd be astounded if you don't know about Paula and her story and her campaign about Oliver. So I'm going to hand over straight to you, Paula, to describe and introduce yourself and start to talk about the person at the centre of this, Oliver, your son.
Thank you, Matthew. So, of course, I am Paula McGowan. I'm also the founder of the Oliver McGowan Mandatory Training on Learning Disability and Autism. And, of course, I'm Oliver's mum. So I'm going to start, if that's okay with you, Matthew, by just telling you a little bit about who Oliver was. You know, like all new parents, and every parent says this, I know. But for Oliver, when he was born, we knew that he was special. Now, I'm the mum of 3 kids. Grown-up kids now, actually. Fantastic. All of them are fantastic. But there was something special about Oliver when he was born. And our love for him was overwhelming. He was born a month premature, but at 3 weeks of age, he developed bacterial meningitis, and he was incredibly ill. And we were told by his doctors that actually they didn't expect him to survive. But against all odds, and you can see Oliver behind me, his strength and determination shone through, and he did survive. Now, he was left as a result of this. He had an infarction, so he had a stroke, which caused a hemiplegia, so mild cerebral palsy. Later on, his diagnosis of autism and a mild intellectual disability. But Oliver's strength and determination was always there. His college were always writing how he's always helping other people less able than himself. He was a huge advocate for people who were less able than himself. He would always stand up for others in the room. He really was a character that was full of life, full of tenacity, full of a determination to the best, to do and achieve the best that he ever could. We loved him. He was just an incredible young person, to be honest.
Tell us then, Oliver was at school. Was that mainstream school?
So Oliver started off in mainstream school, and he progressed up until year 5. We are a military family, and we move every few years. So when we were posted to Cambridge, we sat down as a family and we thought, Oliver was managing very well actually in a mainstream setting, but we knew once he went to secondary school, when an awful lot more is expected and, getting around and so on and so on, so forth, the best option for Oliver would be to go to a special needs school. And he went to a school where there were children like him. So there was obviously children who were more profoundly disabled, but there were also children who were more able, like Oliver. And he did really, really well. So he went to Castle School in Cambridge, and we were posted again in Bristol, and he went to another special needs school in Bristol until he went to college. Again, he went to a specialist college. He started off at Ruscombe Mill, which was great. And then he moved on to National Star College in Cheltenham. And I think that leads on to our story, Matthew, of where things started to go wrong for Oliver.
Yeah, so tell us about that and his what then became the terrible set of circumstances that led to his death in 2016. Help us understand some of that.
Yes. So Oliver, as a result of that infarction with the meningitis, he had epilepsy. So he had focal partial seizures. And for him, his presented very differently. So he would remain fully conscious. He was very aware of them, very aware of himself as a person anyway. So he could still talk through those seizures, but he would be distracted. He'd be more confused, probably, and might not be able to recall a conversation. So like I said, he'd had these all his life. But in that last year, in 2015, he had seizures and he was taken to a children's hospital. Now, whilst he was there, they administered an antidepressant medication because they'd said it was to help his anxiety. But we were shocked because, Oliver was, he had a real can-do attitude. He loved life. We brought him to hospital having seizures. We didn't think he needed a medication like that. We didn't understand medications like that either. And we later found out that actually they lowered the threshold for seizures, so in actual fact increased them. So Oliver was sent home on this medication, and of course the seizures increased significantly, and we had to take him back into the same hospital. But instead of listening to us and to Oliver, they gave him an antipsychotic medication, and the changes in him were, it was the most frightening experience both for Oliver and for us. We'd never seen anything so dramatic, and we kept saying to the doctors, we believe it's absolutely the drugs causing the change to Oliver, because I'd been able, the college had phoned me to say, we think Oliver's having seizures, can you come and get him? At that time I weighed 7.5 stone, picked him up from college an hour's drive away in my mini car, and I'm able to transport him to the children's hospital, having normal conversations in between seizures. But now he's given this medication. He's biting his skin. He's trying to pull his teeth out. It was awful, and he kept apologising. At one point, they placed him under a Section 2 mental health, but they couldn't find any beds because he was still classed as paediatrics. And at long last, they listened to us and they listened to Oliver, and they removed the antipsychotic medication. And within days, he returned back to his normal self. Because Oliver was epileptic, a few weeks later, months, Oliver had some more seizures and he had to go back into that children's hospital. And again, previous lessons hadn't been learned. The first thing they did was to give him antipsychotic medication. And again, he's now gone from having 2 seizures a fortnight to 30 a day. It was just unbelievable. Again, nobody was listening to Oliver first, who had so much insight into himself or us. Now, at my request, he was transferred to a London hospital who I thought would have had a better understanding of his seizures. And that may well be the case, but they had no understanding of autism or intellectual disability, and they had zero tolerance for it. At one point, they'd kept him in a darkened room. When he'd go into a seizure, because Oliver needs to walk around in that seizure, which is, as you'll know, Matthew, that's typical of a focal seizure. He was immediately restrained on a beanbag, and he had 8 members of staff hold him down. He was in seizure. Another time, he would suddenly have 3 members of staff escort him to the toilet while he was trying to use the toilet. Remember, he's very proud. And, suddenly he's got people now in that bathroom with him, in the toilet with him. And again, I questioned, would anybody else do that to a person without those additional needs? It was absolutely horrific. And for the first time, Oliver told me just how scared the staff was making him feel. Back in the children's hospital, we'd been allowed to take Oliver out to actually Casper's, the ice cream parlour. Oliver loved culture and art, and we were taking him out to the museums. So you can get a good picture of how he was between seizures. Now, this hospital then transferred him to a mental health hospital. Again, awful. Nobody first told Oliver what to expect or even where he was going, and nobody spoke to us. Now, mental health had never really touched our family, so we didn't understand it. And on the day, a black van turned up for Oliver, and people dressed in black, like security corps uniforms. And we asked to go with Oliver, and we were not allowed to travel with him. Remember, again, he's autistic. He doesn't know these people, and yet he's transferred much like a criminal would have been in a black van. We were lucky at the PICU, so the mental health hospital. They were fantastic, and they really understood Oliver. And the words from the consultant psychiatrist at the time were that, in his opinion, Oliver was not psychotic, and nor was he mentally ill, and that it was a total misuse of the Mental Health Act. Now, we were told normally they transition from a PICU, so the intensive care unit, onto a ward, and then they transition back into the community. For Oliver, within days, they'd removed all of the antipsychotic medications, and he's gone straight home, straight from that unit. So we were getting told this was highly unusual. That's how strong they felt about this. Now, again, he was given a letter stating he was intolerant / allergic to antipsychotic medications, and this time diazepines. Now, in between this time, he's back at college, he's back doing his sports. I've got to mention Oliver was actually playing for England FA. He was also in the Paralympics. He was training with Team Bath. So he's back doing all of those things again. But then he had the seizures again, and we took him to an adult hospital this time in Bristol. And we thought we were prepared. He had a hospital passport, which would give important information. It detailed those letters. And we explained to the staff how best to help Oliver, how to make reasonable adjustments for him. And we wasn't listened to. He actually had an amazing neurologist in the ED department that night. And he was trying to listen, but other people were interfering with what he was trying to do. And after they'd given him lots and lots of medications to stop the seizures, they weren't stopping. And they wanted to intubate him to facilitate an MRI scan to see what was going on. Absolutely fine. We absolutely agreed with that. And as a consequence of that, Oliver developed double pneumonia. He'd never had a chest infection in his life, but these things happen. Now, we were consulted by the community neuropsychiatrist. She'd met Oliver twice in the community. I know it sounds awful and I hate saying it, but we felt she absolutely did not understand Oliver at all. And she asked us about giving Oliver an antipsychotic medication because when he was coming out of sedation, we were told around about 100% of patients will be anxious and agitated. So coming off, like I said, life support intubation. And we made it absolutely clear to her Oliver's previous reactions, the intolerances, the reactions, and also actually Oliver had made an adverse, he's made advanced
directive,
decision,
was it? Yeah.
that he was not to be given that medication, relating back to what had happened to him previously, and he was promised that that would not happen. We absolutely felt we'd been listened to, but that night she administered an antipsychotic medication. Now, don't forget, Oliver's brought into hospital having seizures and nothing more. He's intubated, we were told, to a coma scale of a -5, which apparently is highly significant. The safeguarding officer had been consulted, and due to Oliver's history, he'd recommended soft handcuffs and a non-pharmaceutical approach. And yet that night, Oliver was administered this medication. Again, when we found out the next day, I made it very clear to the neurologist that was treating him and the ICU consultant. The reactions showed the letters yet again, and obviously this advanced verbal decision Oliver himself had made, and they totally ignored us. I can still remember to this day them turning away as if we were not in the room. Now, over the next few days, Oliver's he starts to look blue around his mouth, and his eyes have become puffy. And we kept saying to the doctors, we're really worried because, Oliver looks very different. He's now having tonic-clonic seizures. He's been given paralysis drugs. He shouldn't have been able to move. And now he's nearly jerking off the bed. At one point, they'd taken him for a scan and they'd had to stop the lift because he's now having clonic-tonic seizures. And we kept saying, we're really worried. Something's going really wrong for Oliver. And we were told that they would tell us when we needed to worry. Like I said, they sent him for a scan of his liver because apparently they were worried about the liver. I think his temperature was going up to 40 degrees, and they weren't giving him any medications for that because they said his liver was elevated. When they sent him for that scan, we said, please do a scan of his brain. We know we can't afford any further damage to it, and he's doing so well. So as a result of that stroke, Oliver has actually lost most of the right-hand side of his brain. But he's doing really well. We knew he couldn't afford any further damage, and we knew our son. We knew things would go wrong, and they said, no, he's fine. The next day, we were told as one of his pupils was slow to react, and they were going to send him for an emergency MRI scan. And I can still remember to this day the ICU consultant almost thrown us into that parents' room, the side room, and you could see he was anxious. He was hopping from one foot to the other. And he told us that Oliver's brain was so badly damaged, it was bulging at the base of his skull. He said he would need emergency surgery. The neurosurgeons came in and said Oliver had neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which is a side effect of those very antipsychotic drugs that Oliver had said he was not to be given. And we'd said the same thing. So he had a shunt fitted, and things had gone disastrously wrong for Oliver. We were told he's now profoundly disabled. He'd be reliant on a tracheotomy. He'd be tube fed for the rest of his life. He was in a vegetative state, worse than that, actually. And the decision was made to turn his life's machines off. Now, we were told he'd die quickly, within hours. Oliver lived on for about 5 days. They said he wouldn't breathe for himself. He's now breathing for himself. It was just, it was horrific, actually. But Oliver, he passed away on the 11th of November, which is significant for us because we're a military family, and Oliver had lived his whole life as part of the
Mm.
Royal Air Force family. And he had made a lasting impression on this earth. He had a meaningful life. And that brings us up to what happened with Oliver.
Poor it's just, and anybody who, and this is fast forward into what you've done there after Oliver died, but who've listened to the story, listened to Oliver, and listened to you and the training, is it's just a litany of ignoring individual preferences, no stated kind of care, isn't it? And families who know the individual best. And before we get into the campaign, what sense did you get from that community I think you said community psychiatrist, and get from the people that then finally gave the antipsychotic medication, about why they were ignoring your wishes and Oliver's, more importantly, Oliver's wishes at that time? Have you ever had an explanation about what all that was about?
No, we've not had an explanation, but it was quite obvious, and we knew at the time what we were witnessing and seeing. So, first of all, we talk about diagnostic overshadowing, and that was clearly taking place with Oliver. They were seeing the autism and the learning disability or the intellectual disability. Now, Oliver, one might think he had challenging behaviour. Is this why they made those decisions? He didn't. He was the most polite young person. He was anxious and he was scared and he was talking repetitively and he was wanting to walk around. So you try to almost reason what were the reasons and these decisions. Why did they come to the decisions they did? Decisions, and that was obviously it was diagnostic overshadowing without a doubt. They saw the disability before they saw the person. They treated Oliver less than, and they certainly treated us less than. They knew best, which is, I feel awful saying that. And, 80% of my own family members are clinicians of one sort or another. My husband is a senior officer in the Air Force. I teach. So nobody should be treated less than. And it was this. I always remember the community neuropsychiatrist when she'd met Oliver for those 2 10-minute appointments. When I tried to speak for Oliver and explain and advocate for him, I was told, we were talking about this the other day actually, she actually said to me, "Mum, you cannot be mum and doctor. You need to know your lane. You are mum, I am doctor." And I can still remember it to this day. And I knew she just didn't get it.
Mm.
And it's awful, isn't it? Because, after everything that's happened and the consequences of what's happened and the fact that you are proven correct, it's all too late. Now,
Mm.
you'd like to think that lessons would be learned, but we know, and that lessons have not been learned. We are now 9 years on with Oliver's death, and the same things are happening over and over. There's more lives lost. And it's the same stories that are being told over and over. I can remember quite clearly always saying, I just want lessons to be learned. And I almost cringe now, which might seem a strange thing to say, but it's because I can hear all the other families saying the same things. And I know that those words are totally ignored. We're almost given a pat on the back, a pat on the head, the sorries. But what are we learning from it? What are we doing to make real change?
So let's talk about that change, because you and help us understand how you have managed, because to get from facing up to the death of your son that should never have happened. He should never have died at that point. He should have had a glittering, as you say, career, should have been a Paralympian, should have had an active, wonderful life. And that grief, and just the world caving in on you to create something that has been a phenomenal campaign. Help us understand how you did that.
I think for me, so probably naivety, I would have to say from the start. So after Oliver died, I genuinely, so we were not in that world where, we're hearing about an awful lot of the abuses of people with a learning disability and autism. We were in this military bubble, really, in a way. So life was really good for us. So when this happened to Oliver, I genuinely thought that the world would be up in arms, not just our country, the world. They would,
Mm.
they'd be absolutely appalled by what had happened to Oliver. And then as time went on, I realized that it was actually quite normal. Isn't that awful to say? This was normal how Oliver was treated. Um, and I just thought it was really obviously wrong for Oliver. He's lost his life, wrong for everybody else like Oliver. I also thought it was wrong for our medics. And you might think that's strange, but I actually thought it was absolutely awful that, as time's going on, I'm realizing that actually our medics, our clinicians, they weren't given any training in really understanding autism, what it is, how it affects a person. Um, I was aware that there were a lot of preconceived ideas of what people thought autism was, and they absolutely did not have any understanding of what a learning disability is. And again, I thought that was so wrong. I really, really did. I became aware of Stomp. I was asked just after Oliver's inquest to go and do a talk at Stomp. And it was actually through talking to parents and listening to those stories that I was starting to realize that actually this was quite common. I was hearing about people with a learning disability having broken jaws, a broken femur, due to restraint, due to people that obviously didn't understand the needs. And so I started innocently, I started networking, and I got in touch with Jane, Chief Nursing Officer of England, um,
Cummins, Jane
Cummins.
Cummins.
Thank you, Matthew. And she was lovely. She really was, and she looked after me. She embraced me. She listened to Oliver's story. So I started there, and then we were walking in the bush. Actually, we just been poked. We just come over to Australia straight after Oliver's inquest. Didn't have a stick of furniture in the house. We're walking through the bush with the dog. So for anyone that doesn't know what the bush is, it's basically the woods. And I said to Tom, I wasn't really Tom, my husband. I wasn't into politics, if I'm honest. Didn't understand politics either. Like I said, we were in this bubble of military and just living our lives. But I knew instantly, I said to Tom, I need to start a parliamentary petition. And he's looking at me, but I knew it couldn't be one of those, you have Just Giving and all these things, don't you?
Mm.
I knew it had to be a parliamentary petition. This voice was in my head, rightly or wrongly, I don't know. Oliver was there, and I could hear it quite clear. It's got to be a parliamentary petition. So I wrote the petition all by myself. Nobody was there nobody was there for guidance. I just knew exactly what to do. I was aware I had to get 100,000 signatures. And I started campaigning. I wasn't on social media. I joined Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and all of those things, and started telling Oliver's story. The media became involved, obviously, around the inquest. The media were very much involved, very, very supportive as well, actually, it's got to be said. So that was going on. Met Jane. I also engaged with Caroline Dinenage, who was the health minister at the time. She was fantastic. She would have conversations with me any time of the day. I've got her private number. That's how supportive she was. So all of those things were going on. I'd met with Baroness Sheila Hollands, and Sir Norman Lamb, and I was supported, but I was also directed as well. They were the motivation. So I started going around all of the medical schools and the universities, the medical universities, the nursing schools, telling Oliver's story. And I was doing all of this absolutely free of charge. This was all in my own time, but I was giving.
And you were living in Australia at the time?
So initially, I was in England
Yeah.
and then Australia. At
Uh,
one point,
okay. Yeah.
I came home from Australia. I was home for 8 weeks and I did 64 presentations, 64,
Wow. Okay.
and completely free of charge. It was all my time, and I gave all of that up. So then, of course, we had.
And how, if I could just ask Paul at that point, so we know, I know, listeners will know hopefully that there's a product at the end of this, and the product being fabulous training about autism and learning disabilities and help him to do what you just described that people were not aware of. How did you, I know you're a teacher and talented, but how did you therefore develop what you were talking to the nursing schools, talking to universities about? How did you get all that together?
So my presentation, so this is not Oliver's training. It was telling Oliver's story. It was
Right.
actually
So
being
it was
honest.
about the person
Yes. So
you knew best, your son. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so it's being honest, always being honest. It
Mm.
was always about not pointing fingers as well. And work, talking collaboratively about what could have been done better. It was also, I talked about reasonable adjustments and what they could look like. I wanted conversations. I wanted to hear what they really thought. I wanted to hear about what they would do in different situations. And definitely the nurses were very, very much on board. Um, sometimes you were talking to the converted. It was the people that weren't in the room that concerned me. That
Yeah.
was that was a challenge, and it was trying to bring people on board with that. Some were defensive because I think they thought I was going to go in with the attitude of pointing fingers and blame. That was not what it was about. It really was not what it was about, and it never has been actually. So
And
it went from there.
and that power of the story is just so important, isn't it? Because that is compelling in its own right.
I think for Oliver, this sounds awful. Oliver is a typical looking teenager. He's a good looking young person. So I started off telling Oliver's story by telling people who he was first. The fact that he played football, he played for England, as I said. So immediately people could start to relate to him. They started to see their own children in Oliver, their own teenagers. I would talk about the fact that Oliver would wind us up by playing Eminem, the rappers. And of course, people can relate to that. The fact
Mm.
that he wore that links, I think it was Africa at the time. You could smell that waft coming out of the bedrooms. And you made Oliver's you brought Oliver's story to life, relatable. And that, I think that was really important. Then you tell the story of what happened, and people are shocked because they don't expect it. And again, there comes that divide where people are relating to Oliver, but they also know about the profoundly disabled people that have been treated badly. And yet people were more up in arms about Oliver, or so it appeared to me, than they were of profoundly disabled people. And again, you can see that discrimination, as if, again, it's ignorance, isn't it? It was almost like, well, that happens to those people. They've got these medical needs. It doesn't happen to our kids.
Yeah.
And you could see it. And there was no malice. There was no malice intended. It was just those unconscious bias, really.
Then you were visible, you're on social media, no doubt taking flack, no doubt, great support, but idiots as well, and dealing with all of that. And how does that then get challenged in your kind of campaign to then land as something that has now been entrenched and is foundational in certainly the commissioned NHS services that we all rightly need to do gradations of training about autism and learning disability. How did that happen?
I think I've been lucky, in all fairness. So I've had tremendous support. The challenges came actually when it went into law. And I've got to say, this sounds awful, but it came mostly from some doctors, not all, not at all. And highly unprofessional, name calling, starting to tell Oliver's story in a very different way to the reality. And of course, they don't know, they weren't there. Really derogatory comments, things like calling us thick, started talking about the aviation model of patient safety and, aviation safety. What they didn't realize is that my husband wrote that policy.
Yeah.
My husband's
Yeah. It's an aviator. Yeah, yeah.
uh, my husband is aircraft safety, um, and all of those things. So I think what you have to do is rise above it, because this comes from a place of defensiveness and fear, and people don't always want change. And I think that's really important, that we've got to bring them on the journey with us. We've got to work together, and we've got to see what works best. Now, when it comes to NHS England, again, they've been fabulous. So we had Amanda Pritchard. She did Oliver's training, both tiers, and she had her senior management do the same. NHS England leaders, they all did the training. She then did a champion video. So that was happening. So she was leading. We also had Ruth May. She was absolutely outstanding, such a tremendous support to me. She would have me coming to her conferences, Chief Nursing Officers conferences, having me do talks. They really did invite me, and I've been really fortunate. Duncan, the new Chief Nursing Officer of England. That's right. Again, incredibly supportive. We've now got Danny Mortimer, who's now in charge of Oliver's training. Again, the door's always open. We've got Nick Bolton. Sorry. Again, the door is open. I think I count myself very, very lucky that the support is there. I'm sure I don't see an awful lot of things. I am aware, obviously, you've had the legal side of things going on in the background. We are a very small team. The Oliver McGowan Mandatory team is very small. That needs to be much bigger, because obviously we've got to look at data, who's doing what, who's not doing, how's the rollout going, what's it looking like across the country. Also, Oliver's training has been given an awful lot of money from the government. So how is that money being spent? It could only be spent on Oliver's training. And again, it's looking at that. Money was given to the ICBs. Have they spent that money? What is the percentage of rollout in each region? And what's that looking like? A lot of hard work for a tiny team. So it's making sure that Oliver's training is under the right team, to make sure it's affordable.
And then what's your perspective on how that doesn't just land with you and the small team to be the champion of Oliver's training, but for it to be fully adopted and just normal? Any organization, this is our approach and we are responsible for doing it. I maybe should be answering my own question, given I'm an NHS chief executive, but what's your perspective on that? How do we make that not a campaign and something, Paula puts a mirror up to us, but we put a mirror up to ourselves and saying, are we doing it correctly?
Absolutely. So I think what you're talking about is business as usual, treating it with the same respect as safeguarding and so on. I think what it is, it's listening. We've got to listen to leaders such as yourself, and seeing what the barriers are. That's really important. So we've got to start looking at cost, affordability, sustainability. They're crucial to making Oliver's training the success that it currently is. Now, there are barriers in that the funding will run out at some point. So how do we address these things? And of course, I think an awful lot of trusts are not thinking smartly. They're thinking it's much harder than it needs to be. Now, the Southwest are really leading on this at the moment. Debbie Riley, the ex-SRO for Oliver's training, but is she's Southwest for education and training, and they're looking at really good ways of taking ownership and getting it rolled out right across their trusts. And it's by the building hubs, and they're getting their own trainers trained up and their own lived experience, and they are doing great things in that region. And I think it's about trusts collaborating together, instead of just handing money out to outside agencies, and some of which are charging extortionate amounts of money. The work has to be done. You need to look around and look at different ways of doing this, because it can be done.
Yeah. And I don't know, we just an example, we've we network and do that with our colleagues in other organizations, and we're using the lived experience of people from our local areas to come in and do that from already there. And it adds so much more power because they can talk about things that are about the local area, local landmarks, local
Absolutely.
issues, and say that's my reality. And it's making that then just normal in terms of how we do our business, isn't it?
Well, to be honest, it's not rocket science, and actually, it shows that it's not, is it? It's ludicrous, actually, because we've got lived experience traveling right across the country. That's ludicrous. We should be, you know, Oliver's training is about employing people
Yeah.
to deliver that training. People who've never had employment before and are doing this, they should be recruited from their local areas. And exactly like you've just said, they bring their own stories about how to support them best when accessing your trusts and things like that. But it's good to hear that you are collaborating with other trusts in how to do this better. You know, it's now in legislation. It is actually in the statutory mandatory training list within NHS England. It's in the NHS contracts. So we need to stop complaining that you've got to do it. It's how do we do it? And how do we get on with doing that? And like I said before, it's about working together. Stop being defensive. Let's just get on with it. It's in law now. Either you do Oliver's training, which is the gold standard, or you have to do an absolute mirror copy of it. You cannot get around the frameworks. The code of practice is quite clear. You've got to have lived experience delivering this training. Learning disability has got to be taught entirely separately to autism. It's exactly the same. So I have no idea why people would want to go elsewhere. Oliver's training's been evaluated by the government. It's had, I think it was 85% positive feedback, which was unprecedented feedback to the government. So we need to get on with it. We really do. And a lot of places are.
And absolutely essential, Paula. I have to say, I was mulling before we talked, and I've done lots of training in my life, but I remember doing the first training, which was the online kind of process e-learning package, and it was the only training I think I've ever done where afterwards I just couldn't work. It was so impactful and so challenging, and I just sat there despairing and thinking, what are we doing? And we need that jolt sometimes to say, this is the reality and this is what we need to do about it. And you're right. It's interesting that you say if people don't do this training, they have to do something else. A parallel to that would be arguments I've had in the past with clinicians of, I won't follow NICE guidelines. And my response has been, well, I want therefore the equivalent of NICE guidelines written out, signed off by the medical director to the same standard as NICE guidelines are produced. And then we'll agree that you follow those guidelines. And of course, the answer quickly is, oh, well, we don't want to do that. We'll then follow NICE guidelines. The same is true for this training, isn't it?
It is. And Matthew, that shows true leadership, because leadership has got to come from the top down. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're showing that actually this is what you've got to do. We've got to get on with it. Either you do this or you do that. Make your choice. We've got to remember that people are human and mistakes are made, and people may think they know better or innocently getting things wrong. And again, it's bringing it back to that, and putting in front of them all of these failings. These people are dying that should not be dying. What we've not mentioned is people dying because of inappropriate DNRs placed on them, simply because they've got a learning disability. And as human beings, out of the job, aside of the job, we would step back and say, oh my God, are we actually doing this? Why did we restrain this person? When was that ever okay? Did I go into this profession to accept this type of treatment of people who are vulnerable? What is our reasoning behind our decision making? And are we using the excuses of this is what the NHS is failing, the NHS doing this, the pressures are on us? You as a human, as a decision maker, you've made those decisions, and we have to be accountable for those decisions that we make. And we have to remember, actually, people are human. And would they like that to
And
happen to their loved ones?
which is a good kind of link to, I think, where we'll kind of, as we get towards the end of this podcast, is you've you've remarkably seen a lot in the NHS and no doubt abroad, because it's not just the NHS. I had a friend who originally who was in Canada, and they wanted the Oliver McGowan training because they weren't doing it there. So this is an international thing. But let's just concentrate back into the UK. You've seen, heard, had the feedback from a lot of areas. What's your, just thinking about leadership and culture, what would you say, Paula, are the ingredients that allow the essence of Oliver's campaign to become real? What do you see are the ingredients that make it flourish and make it normal? Well, you said earlier, and what are the things that get in the way?
Well, there's always money that gets in the way, time.
Yeah.
But I think the main ingredients are listening. We've all got to listen to each other. We've got to work collaboratively. Unlike the aviation, the aircraft model, no blame culture, we do have to work to that. Obviously, that doesn't mean that nobody's accountable when things have deliberately gone wrong. But I think it's important that we do look at that and work together in that way. I think leaders need to take responsibility. So many leaders within our NHS and social care. And I had a meeting with somebody, a really nice chap, just a few days ago, who actually wasn't aware of the legalities of Oliver's training. He wasn't aware that Oliver's training was in legislation. Obviously, learning disability and autism training is in legislation. He was not aware of that. And again, so I would say, if you're going to be a leader, lead properly. You've got to know these things. Don't rely on middle management. Um, Obviously, they do need to know these things and they do need to feed it up. But I'm finding middle management don't always pass things up to the senior management, and a lot of things are hidden. So again, it's that listening to each other. It's being curious. It's about, like I said, senior leaders getting into the middle ground and actually being curious and asking questions. Why complaints may be coming in? What can we do better as a team? If it's a defensive manner, I think our leadership needs to be looking at, why are we defensive? Is there a case for it? Or actually we're othering, we're seeing people as them and us. And that's where we need to start changing culture. It is a culture change, isn't it? We're looking at that. We've got to move and evolve and try to be better, because currently we're not better and we're getting it wrong. And we have to question ourselves. As professionals, we have to question ourselves and say, well, actually, we're the ones that are getting it wrong. So what can we do better? I'm not sure if I've answered that question for you, really.
No, you have. You've framed that really well in terms of all those ingredients of leadership that it yeah, it's multifaceted. You've got a curiosity, it's an agitation to be something different, and as you said earlier, quite often it's about doing the basics right and keep on doing the basics right all the time.
Don't we? We get lost in politics
Yeah.
within organisations, and I understand. Like I said, 80% of my family members are clinicians. I know what the pressures are within NHS hospitals and social care, of course. But we've got to remember to humanise people, especially the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Never allow an organisation to make you into something that you don't want to be.
Yeah. You've got choices and stick with them. Absolutely. Yeah. Last question then, Paula. I'm struck in this series. I'm struck by everything that you said, but I'm struck by repeatedly you have said you weren't out for, my words, vengeance. You weren't out for blame. You wanted change to happen. And this series 8 is about those campaigns and yours that have been so successful. Just how much you can, just help us understand, though, how you personally, and no doubt with the family and your husband and the broader family, have been able to put aside what is a terrible thing, where there were individual errors and systemic problems that led to your son's death, How have you managed to then move from that to then create this massive campaign without that blame? Because at the heart of this is your leadership in this campaign, and I'm really intrigued about how you've been able to do that.
I think shock initially, to be honest. But also Oliver, I've mentioned before, he was so kind and giving. And I see myself very much as Oliver's voice, very much that way. I didn't want what had happened to Oliver change who I was as a person. I didn't want to become angry and bitter. And I understand why people are, but I didn't want to change who I was as a person. And I know that Oliver wouldn't want to do that to me. I'm very good at partitioning my mind. The person who administered the medications to Oliver that took his life is kept very separate. I don't open that box. I don't go there. I don't need to go there. That does not, what happened there does not mean that every other medic or clinician is the same. I know that our clinicians do a fantastic job and they're doing the best they can. And not everyone should ever be tarred with the same brush as to what happened to Oliver. That was a minority. And I will never, ever change who I am as a person and feel, you just can't do that. I just don't like that type of behavior anyway. But I've also learned very quickly, if we want to bring about real change, we've got to work together. And, nobody deserves to have the finger pointed at them. Nobody deserves to be shouted at. And if you do that, people will walk away and they will not engage. And you know what I say? Absolutely. I'd walk away as well. So it's honestly, it really is about let's work together, let's get on, bring about real change. And just remember actually to respect each other. I
Mm.
think that's really important.
Yeah. Paula, you've been very gracious with your time and your thoughts. You've talked wonderfully about Oliver and his early life and how his character, you lit up as you were talking, how his character shone through, his wonderfulness with others. He had struggles from his clinical issues all the way through, and then just the tragedy and the litany of problems that you were not listened to. Oliver wasn't listened to, more importantly, frankly, and that culminated in a whole set of issues and him dying in 2016. The campaign, the networking, the small things that led to big things that have led to leaders getting on board and supporting you to have a campaign. It is no, I know, work nationally in the NHS. It is a hard thing to get something like this enshrined in law. Getting things enshrined in law is extremely tough. Getting it in our contracts, getting it in the detail of how we should do things, but more importantly, getting a sustainable ethos of respect and how people can support people and ensure that learning disabilities, autism, and all those things are better understood, so we can provide great care. Paula, I'd take my hat off to you. You're always inspiring, and you've got, for those that are listening, behind Paula is a wonderful big photo of Oliver smiling, and you are, I think what I heard, not your words, but you're reflecting the character of Oliver to get something positive out of a tragedy, and for that, I think I and all of us should thank you, and thank you for spending time discussing that here on Leadership and Culture in Healthcare.
You are more than welcome. You are more than welcome. And thank you for your kind words. We can do this, work together, and we'll do it.